KiTavo. KiTavo, which is Hebrew for when you enter, upon entering. KiTavo. So tonight's Torah portion is about the so-called blessings and the curses that's referred to and taught every year, every cycle of Torah teachings at this time, which is really what the Torah portion is mainly about. We've taught on this many, many times, and it's a pretty simple, straightforward teaching, the blessings and the curses. Now we're going to look at some other aspects of tonight's Torah portion that's very relevant even to where we are today. So I'm going to consider tonight's Torah portion from a slightly different perspective. Maybe we'll see what God does. It's really up to God, actually. So, the blessings and the curses. God wanted Israel to appear before him as they came into the land at the place that he had designated for them to appear, which was clearly stated in Shechem, at Gerizim, at Mount Ebal and Gerizim. Gerizim, the root word there for Gerizim is, I'm pretty sure if I have it correctly, someone's texting me, it could be serious. No, not serious. All right. Is Garaz, Gerizim, Garaz, which is to cut. So that's appropriate, right? Gerizim, Geraz, which is to cut. What happened at Mount Gerizim that relates to cut? Covenant. So this is what God wanted from Israel. When they came into the land, it was a priority that they would get to Gerizim and they would cut that covenant, which is a covenant that had already been cut 40 years later. Where? Sinai. But God found it necessary that Israel, once they come into the land now, that they would go to Gerizim, Ebal, Gerizim, and they would there reestablish or reinitiate the covenant there. It took a while. It didn't happen for quite a while. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, right? And we'll go over this again. So they were to also appear before God in the place where God would establish his name. So tonight's Torah portion is the basis of a bit of a controversy as it relates to the Samaritans. You say, wait a minute, that's the people of the Bible, the Good Samaritan. The Samaritans exist today. They are still in the land of Israel today, and they're still in the place on that mountain where they were 2,500 years ago, the Samaritans. And so we'll go over that whole thing with the Samaritans and their belief that the place for God's name is Mount Gerizim. How many of us have been at Gerizim? All right, so most of us here, we've been to Gerizim. We stood on the mountain, we looked over Shechem. How many of us have actually seen the altar? Not me. The altar, not in Shechem, the one that's on the other side of Gerizim, between Ebal and Gerizim. You can't see it from where we go. No, I don't think any of us have been able to get around that mountain to see that altar. But it's there. It is right there. And Aaron Lipkin, you know Aaron Lipkin, who is Avi's son, he's sort of a specialist on the altar that's there, Joshua's altar. It's still there today. What did the Palestinians attempt to do? To destroy it. The Palestinians knew exactly the significance of that altar, and they wanted to take all of its stones and crush it into gravel so they can drive their cars. Now, they pretended that they didn't know, but they well knew what the altar was. It was well established for millennia that was Joshua's altar that stood right between Gerizim and Ebal. So, but God begins, in tonight's Torah portion, it begins with God saying to Israel, when you enter the land, you go to the place where I will establish my name. A few weeks ago, we talked about Deuteronomy chapter 12 to 16. How many times did we see in that Torah portion references made to the place where God will establish his name? 12 times. In those 4 chapters, God made mention to the place that he will establish his name. that place ultimately became Gerizim. No, it didn't. And this is the pressure with the Samaritans today. No, the place was a place that they had not yet conquered, which was Jebus, Zion, which would become Jerusalem. Right? And so that's the whole emphasis, really, of the Torah portion we looked at 3 or 4 weeks ago, and it begins with that emphasis tonight. So let's read here in Deuteronomy chapter 26. We're going to read 1 and 2. So 3 or 4 weeks ago, Deuteronomy, that Torah portion that dealt with Deuteronomy 12 to 16, it's all about the place where God would establish his name. What did he say? What are some of the things he said in those chapters? He will establish a place for his votive offerings, for his approaches, where he would be worshipped, where his name would be lifted up, where the sons of Israel will come 3 times a year to celebrate the 3 most important feasts. And that place, of course, we know is Jerusalem. So let's read about what we begin this Torah portion with tonight. Then it shall be when you enter the land. Now this seems pretty immediate, right? It shall be when you enter the land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall possess it and live in it. That you shall take and that you shall take some of the first of all the produce of the ground which you bring in from your land, and that the Lord your God gives you, you shall put it in a basket and go to the place where the Lord your God chooses to establish his name. So what is he referring to? He's referring to bringing the first fruits up to the place where God would establish his name, which is Jerusalem. But reading those verses, it seems as if God expects this to happen as they enter into the land. How long did it take Israel to take Jebus, Jerusalem, the Zion? How long did it take? About 400 years. Roughly 400 years. It took Israel to take Jebus, Jerusalem. Remember what the word Zion means, right? The word Zion is an interesting word. It's not actually a Hebrew word, and I did quite a bit of study on this. It's not even an Aramaic word. We're going to see tonight that Yaakov, Jacob, who became Israel, is considered or called in this Torah portion an Aramean. We're going to see this here in a moment. Why? Because he was Aramean. He spoke Aramean. He was of Aramean lineage. But the word Zion is not Aramean, and it's not Hebrew in its root. Not sure what it is. But the word Zion or Zion, it's a profound word when you think of the implications of it. Zion means a sign, an indicator. Here it is what the word Zion means. Like you have a road sign, a very important road sign, and it points out a certain place, even the significance of that place. Well, that's what the word Zion or Zion means, the place. Now you can take that word Zion in its meaning and apply it so powerfully to what the significance of Jerusalem is, can't you? All right, we'll talk about that some more. All right, so the place where God will establish his name. We know that to be, in fact, of course, Jerusalem. Now, what about the Samaritans and their position? We'll discuss that here shortly. Now, let's read, as a sidebar, let's read the references there that refers to Jacob or Israel as an Aramean. So in chapter 26, 3 to 5, so let's read 3 to 5. You shall go to the priest who is in office at that time and say to him, I declare this to the Lord my God, that I have entered the land which the Lord swore to our fathers to give us. Then the priest shall take the basket from your hand. This relates to what we read earlier. Take the basket from your hand and set it down before the altar of the Lord your God. You shall answer and say before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean. It's referring not to Abraham here, but to Jacob. And he went down to Egypt and sojourned there, a few in number, but there he became great, a mighty and populous nation. So this is the nation of Israel, an Aramean people. You know, there's a lot of noise today about the Hebrew Israelites. Who knows about the Hebrew Israelites, right? what is the basis of the Hebrew Israelite position? That the Israelites were Cushites. They were a Cushite people that came from south in the continent of Africa. Well, listen, this right here denies and debunks all of it. God is saying to Israel, your father was an Aramean. Who are the Arameans? They are the sons of Shem. Very clearly, right? You can't miss it. Your father was an Aramean. He went into Egypt. He went into Egypt from where? From Aram and the land of Israel. And there he became a populous nation, meaning many people. And God brought him out from that place. An Aramean people, the people of Israel. So now along the way, many foreigners joined the camp of Israel. Many, right? We know that Moses married a Cushite woman, an African woman. And what happened when he married the African woman? Miriam got upset with him. God is not a racist. So the whole point of the Hebrew Israelites, it's not about race. It's about what God did. God took an Aramean, who was a son of Shem, took him into Egypt, caused him to become a great and populous nation, brought him out for his glory and his purpose. Many peoples have been joined to the people of Israel since then. There's a huge humbug about the Ashkenazi Jews. And the people who support the Hebrew Israelite nonsense are saying, well, that's proof. The Ashkenazi Jews, they were all Anglo. Yes, they were. Just like the Ethiopians who joined themselves to the people of Israel. You see, it's not about a race. It's about what God is doing with his people and the people that he has announced to be his people. The sons of Israel. Who's Israel? Who's Israel? The sons of Israel. Who is Israel? Jacob. When did Jacob become Israel? When he had his transformative experience, his born-again experience. Where did that happen? At the river Jabbok. God met him face to face, where he was an Aramean, and that night he was transformed, where spiritually he was no longer an Aramean, but spiritually he became what? An Israelite. He became the father of all Israel, because he strove with God, he fought with God, and overcame, became Israel. God took Israel, Yaakov, Israel, the Aramean, that's what it's saying, took him into Egypt. Now, one thing about what God did with Israel and Egypt is that he incubated them. Not intubate, but incubate. He incubated them. How did he incubate Israel? Made Israel distinct from the Egyptians. Who were the Egyptians at that time? They were the sons of Mitzrayim. I'm feeling led to touch on this. They were the sons of Mitzrayim. Who was Mitzrayim? He was the son of Ham. Now, who was Cush? Cush was the son of Ham. The Cushite people were very distinct. They were the Afrikaner people. The people of Mitzrayim were the sons of Ham, but they were distinct from the Cushites. And this created a great pressure, a great struggle in the dynasties of Egypt. You had Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt is south into Africa. So the tribes of the Cushites, along the Nile, close to Kilimanjaro, they were Upper Egypt. And many times they would war against the Mitzrayim, the sons of Mitzrayim, in the north, which was Lower Egypt. Why Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north? Because of the flow of the Nile. The Nile is one of those few rivers that goes from south to north. So the Cushites, who came from the area of Kilimanjaro and northwards, they were Upper Egypt. And many times they strove against, or warred against, Lower Egypt. That was the struggle. But in the midst of all of that, God incubated the sons of Israel where? In Goshen. Goshen was a delta. You know what a delta is? A delta is a little triangle of land surrounded by water. And God took the people of Israel and put them right there. The Egyptians hated them and did not intermingle or intermarry with them. They were seen as the enemies of Egypt, not only to the southern, to Lower Egypt, but to Upper Egypt as well. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt couldn't stand the people of Israel because they were a threat. Anyone knows why they were a threat. I'm going to dismantle the Hebrew Israelite thing right now. Who knows why Israel was a threat to Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt? Anyone?
Well, because they were multiplying quickly and they were afraid they were going to align with the Hyksos.
Hyksos, right. The point is, the arch enemies of Egypt, Upper and Lower Egypt, were the Hyksos. Who were the Hyksos? They were a Semitic people. And the pharaohs of Egypt were horrified that these raiders, these Semitic raiders, would come over and destroy Egypt, which they did. They overcame Egypt a few times. And so the people of Israel were Semitic and were horrified the Egyptians. Pharaoh himself said it. They are multiplying, and if they multiply, they will join our enemies, who are the Hyksos, the Semitic people, like they are Semitic. Done away with completely with the Hebrew Israelite argument. Now, you can't argue with these people. Why? Because they're passionate about it. They come from a point of emotion and not history. Their historiography is designed by people with agendas. Elijah Muhammad designed that lie. And I feel bad for people that are tied up in that Hebrew Israelite lie, because it's deceptive. It's not only deceptive, it's wrong, it's corruptive. People need to be set free from that. Let me say something else about the Cushite people, the people of Africa. They've always been connected to Israel. They've always had a passion for the people of Israel. Never did they want to replace the people of Israel. Never. Only after Elijah Muhammad made those statements about the people of Africa being the true Israelites did they want to replace Israel. How many peoples have come upon this planet that has wanted to replace Israel? Can you count them on one hand, two hands? How many people have come upon the scene that found it necessary to replace the actual descendants of Jacob? Endless. They come and they go. You know, we have the two-house people, and that's another replacement movement. You have the Messianic Jews, and to a certain extent, that's a replacement movement. Christianity, on and on and on. I'm afraid to say that the Hebrew Israelite movement is just another one in the procession of peoples that believe that they're going to replace Israel. Israel can never be replaced. They're God's people, period. God incubated them for 400 years in Israel, and he preserved them, brought them out, a mighty people, mixed with all sorts of other peoples, which is the wonder of Israel. So when the Ashkenazi people in the 7th century, 8th century, joined themselves to Israel. Now, I'm not sure why I'm led to do this, but I'm going to do it. The people of Israel has never been a people to forcibly convert anyone. They were never a people that was set or focused on conversion. They were always a people that wanted to live the life that God had ordained for them, and if people are attracted to it, good, come on in. That's the way of Israel. Now, during the Hashmonean period, which is the period of the Maccabees, we're talking about 200 BC. During that period, one of I think his name was John HaKohen, HaGadol Kohen was his name. John HaGadol Kohen. Yohanan HaGadol Kohen. John, the great priest, the high priest. He became a ruler in Israel. He was Hashmonean. He was one of the descendants of the Maccabees. And he decided that he was going to convert the Idumeans, the people of Idumea in the south. And the Idumeans said, okay, we don't want to become Jews. He said, well, you got to become Jews if you want to become a part of what we're doing. And they said, okay. So for the first time ever in history, Israel did a mass conversion and has regretted it since then. The Idumeans, they were not natural sons of Israel, but they were all sort of blessed and said, you're now sons of Israel. They regretted that. The regret of that conversion is reflected in Herod the Great. Herod the Great was an Idumean. Now, he wasn't so great, but he was an Idumean. Now, another thing happened in the 7th or 8th century. After Islam began to raid Jewish communities in Babylon, what was Babylon? Islam began to harass all of the Jewish communities of Susa, which was the capital of Persia, and into Babylon. Well, Jews began to flee. They went to Spain, they went to North Africa, they went to what is today Turkey, and many of them simply went north into the region of the Baltic Sea and north. As they went north, they encountered a kingdom, the Kanaz, the Ashkenaz, the Kanaz people, the people of Kanazia. I think it's Kanazia. And their king was so impressed with their way of life. The king of Ashkenaz was so impressed with their way of life that he decreed that everyone in his kingdom would become Jews. Now, the Jewish people, the sons of Israel, that entered into his realm, did not go there for that purpose. They were simply running away from Islam. Islam was wiping out the people of Israel. And so, the PowerPoint presentation I have here, no, it's gone. So Israel, in good numbers, I've read somewhere, I've heard lectures and I've read somewhere that there were about 20,000 Jews that fled Babylon, went north and into the region of Ashkenaz. The king said, I love your people, I love your religion, you're an ingenious, you're good people for my kingdom, we're all going to become Jews. And so he made a decree, everyone now, we're now Jews. And that's how we have Ashkenazi Jewry. You know, Anglo-looking Jews. They were never Anglo. Blonde hair, blue-eyed Jews never happened. It only happened because of that decision by that particular king who said that all of his people are now Jews. So the Hebrew Israelite people point to that and they say, wait a minute, the Jews are not white? And they build their argument around that. Well, no, they're not white. Jews are not a particular, a distinct racial demographic. Today, they are a mix of all sorts of people, but the natural descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still there. That DNA is still very much intact. So all of that to say that the Jewish people today are descendants of Aram. They are by genetic distinction Arameans, by and large, mixed with different peoples. So no one can replace them. Why? Because God made a covenant with Jacob. He made a covenant with Jacob where? Who knows where Jacob went to? He made a covenant with Jacob through his grandfather, Abraham, at Mount Ebal, exactly where we're talking about tonight. So God made a covenant with Abraham at Ebal, and then that covenant was extended to Jacob. Jacob went into the land of Egypt, where he became a mighty people, and God brought him out to fulfill every bit of what he promised to Abraham. Wonderful story. So he brings them into the land. He tells them to go to the place where I will establish my name. For what purpose? To carry out everything we read 3 weeks ago concerning God's desire for that place, which was Jerusalem. Now, let's talk about the Samaritans. The Samaritans now today, and they still hold that position today, they say that that place is Gerizim. And so in Gerizim today, in fact, every Passover, they offer lambs on top of Mount Gerizim because they believe that Gerizim is the place that God has established his name. There's a bit of a controversy about this. It's an ancient controversy, right? Goes back to the time of the ancient Samaritans. It exists today, right? Jews and Samaritans today in the land of Israel, they debate this issue from the standpoints of Israel, the Jewish people. It's a foolish argument. From the standpoint of the Samaritans, it's a foolish argument. God established Gerizim. Now, why are they so adamant about this? Because of tonight's Torah portion. It is because of tonight's Torah portion that the Samaritans today are still maintaining that the place for God's name is Mount Gerizim. Why? Because tonight's Torah portion begins with the very statement that God will establish a place for his name. God says to the people of Israel through Moses, when you come into the land, implying that it was something that they were supposed to do right away. On top of that, God brought up the reality of Gerizim and Ebal. They were two separate things, but the people of the Samaritans believed it was one and the same. In other words, they believed that when God said, go to the place where I will establish my name, and then in the same text, God says, build an altar for me at Gerizim and Ebal, they believed that was pretty straightforward. The conclusion is, Gerizim is that place. How do we know that they're wrong? We'll talk about that. So let's read. So, let me see. Let's read about what God said concerning Gerizim and Ebal. Chapter 27, tonight's Torah portion. Verse 4 to 6. Let's read it. So it shall be, when you cross the Jordan, you shall set up on Mount Ebal these stones, as I am commanding you today, and you shall coat them with lime. What's lime? Plaster. That's what they would have used for plaster at that time. So you build an altar of stones. You just stack stones and you build an altar. The ancient Israeli altars are very distinct. They form sort of a swirl type thing where you start from one point and you go around, and then ultimately you get to the top of the altar. That's the classic Israeli altar. They're found in many archaeological sites. That's exactly what's there today. So envision an altar that has the form of sort of like a G, but it keeps going until finally you get to the top, made of stones and covered over with plaster. All right, that's what God wanted Israel to build at Ebal and Gerizim. Moreover, you shall build there an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. You shall not yield an iron tool on them. You get that? Stones only. You don't work the stones with tools. Just stack stones and you cover it with plaster. You shall build the altar to the Lord your God of uncut stones, and you shall offer on it burnt offerings to the Lord your God. That's simple. Go to Gerizim, build this altar, and there also they are to do what? Sacrifices and repeat the covenant. The covenant that was made with Israel at Mount Sinai. So what is God doing here? What is God's intent? What do you think God's intent is? It's seldom that we actually know God's intent, but here it's obvious what God's intent is. God's intent is that when Israel actually enters the land, that they would initiate this covenant at Ebal and Gerizim. What's the significance of Ebal and Gerizim? Shechem. What's the significance of Shechem? The oaks of Mamre. What's the oaks of Mamre? Where Abraham, right? God met Abraham, and that's where the covenant was initiated, the oaks of Mamre. So the oaks of Mamre represents Gerizim and Ebal. So God wanted Joshua, the people of Israel, to go to that place, the oaks of Mamre, where God began the covenant 400 years earlier, and reinitiate the action. So think of the beauty of it, the symmetry of it. God made a covenant with Abraham. On that very night, he said, your descendants will go, it's so wonderful, your descendants will go into a land where they will be slaves for 400 years. In the 400th year, I will bring them out and bring them into this land. And what did God want? As soon as you come into the land, Joshua, you go right to that place where I made that promise to Abraham 400 years before, and you reinitiate that very same covenant with the descendants of Abraham. How symmetric, how poetic is that? That's what God wanted. Beautiful. Joshua didn't do it right away. It took some time. What was the mechanism that God used to bring Joshua up to Gerizim? Anyone? What did God do? Because apparently Joshua kind of lost track of what was important. I think war with Jericho and all of the other troubles would have distracted him, and he was distracted. What did God use? What did God do to get Joshua's attention back to Gerizim? The defeat at Ai. Joshua and the people of Israel were going about their business. We defeated Jericho. Now we're just going to go take Ai. Along the way, we'll just do exploits. So Joshua sends a battalion of men up to Ai, I think 400 men or something. He figured Ai would be easy. Look at what we just did to Jericho. That's easy. So he sends up a small contingent of men up to Ai, and what happened? They got plastered. They got driven back. They came back with their tails between their legs. And Joshua did some internal soul searching then, and he discovered that Israel was in sin with the situation with Achan. Was in sin. But beyond that, Joshua realized that I did not go to Ebal. And that's the first thing he did once he took care of the situation with Ai. So as soon as he made right with the people of Ai, he said, pause, stop right here. Let's leave the Jordan Valley, Gilgal. Let's go up to Ebal and do the thing that we're supposed to do, which was to build the altar there at Gerizim and repeat the covenant, reinitiate the covenant, and that's what he does. Then he moves forward to conquer the land, which he never did completely. Joshua, the people of Israel, never fully conquered the land as God wanted them to. And this was a terrible thing because it created the conditions under which the Canaanites, the pagans, were a constant stumbling block to Israel. Ultimately, Israel will be driven out of the land because of that error. Because of the failings of Joshua and the people of Israel, ultimately they would be driven out from the land because along the way, Israel just embraced the sin of the Canaanites. They were not supposed to interact with the Canaanites. Why? Why were they not supposed to interact with the Canaanites? Because they were horrible pagans. They worshiped in the most horrible way. Killed their children, homosexuality, worship of homosexuality, prostitution, male-female prostitution, worship of prostitution, the worst kind of idolatry. God wanted that stuff out of the land so that it would not affect the people of Israel. They didn't do it, it affected the people of Israel. Ultimately, Israel was driven out. We know the story. Driven out from the land. Every replacement theologist says, hey, there it is. God rejected them. He pushed them out of the land. They're no longer his people. Now we are. That would be true if he didn't make promise after promise after promise that he will restore the descendants of Jacob back to the land of Israel. Over and over and over, he says it through his holy prophets, that he will bring them back. The same people, and he will restore them to the land. Would they look the same? No, they won't. They would transform a little bit, a little darker, a little lighter. Yeah, which is what happened. But this is the same people, same covenanted people. Now, let's read in 27 now concerning how this altar was to be used to establish this covenant again. So, chapter 27, 11 to 14. Moses also charged the people on that day, saying, when you cross the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. What are they to do? To stand on Mount Gerizim. So you have Mount Gerizim. These are the tribes that were to stand on Mount Gerizim to pronounce the blessings. Now, is it me or verse 11 seems to indicate that God or Moses expected Israel to go right to Gerizim? What do you think? Moses also charged the people on that day, saying, when you cross the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. So, it seems like this was their priority to get done. Along the way, smack Jericho, and move on. Perhaps that's what God wanted. Don't pause, don't stop. Just go. That would have really reflect faith, right? Israel's marching forward. They're going to Gerizim. The people, the Canaanites attack, wipe them out by faith. That's, I believe, is what God wanted. All right, so for the curse, these shall stand on Ebal, Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. The Levites shall then answer and say to all the men of Israel, with a loud voice, and it goes on to the curses and the blessings. So it's very simple what God wanted. God wanted this. Joshua was supposed to smack the people of Jericho, get them out of the way, move on. Move on to where? To Ebal, to Gerizim. Get to Gerizim, build an altar there. 6 of the tribes of Israel on one mountain, Gerizim. 6 of the tribes of Israel on the other mountain, Ebal. And there you begin to announce the blessings and the curses. What will happen, the blessings, if Israel would obey God and follow after his word? The curses, what will happen if you don't obey God and follow after his word? The blessings and the curses. What's the effect of the blessings? Jim O'Brien read this tonight for us in Hebrew. What are the effects of the blessings? Jim, tell us what you read, if you would. Would you be able to read that again, not in Hebrew, but in English? The effects of the blessings would be, Jim's going to read that for us. If they would obey him, they would become a people set apart by God, an Am Segula, for God's glory, honor, and fame. God also said that you would be a priestly nation, a nation of priests. He said you would be the head and not the tail. On the other hand, from Mount Ebal, Reuben, Gad, and the others, what were they saying? If you disobey God, you will flee for your existence. You will go from nation to nation, fleeing from God. That's what the curses are about. Curses upon Israel, should they not obey God. The blessings and the curses. Now, what happened? Israel did exactly what God knew they would do, yet they were his people. I want you to hear that. What did Israel do for 500 years? Or actually, 1,000 years, non-stop, once they entered into the land, proved that they could not obey God.
They took up the pagan rituals.
They embraced the paganism that was there, should not have been there. It became a thorn in their sides, and they were assimilated into the paganism, which brought about the curses. The end of the curse was what? God drove them out into the nations. Seemingly, from the standpoint of the nations, a people cursed. A people no more. From the standpoint of the nations. So you can understand why so many movements of people wanted to replace Israel. You can understand that, right? Look at them. God has rejected them, but hold up right there. Even in tonight's portion and going forward, God made it very clear. He knew that Israel would reject him. Nevertheless, he made plans for the ultimate regathering of Israel. Constantly you see it. Now at Mount Sinai, I'm going to belabor this just a little bit. At Mount Sinai, 40 years earlier, God said to Israel, stay away from idolatry when you come into the land. Keep my sanctuary holy, his dwelling place, and observe my Shabbats. Leviticus chapter 26. If you do these 3 things, good things will happen. In fact, if you look at Leviticus 26, it's sort of a synopsis of the blessings and the curses. It's in there, Leviticus 26. God says if you stay away from idolatry, if you observe my Sabbaths and keep my sanctuary pure and holy, you're going to be blessed. Your crops will come in bountifully. The nations will have a witness. You will be a witness to the nations. And then he goes on in Leviticus chapter 26 and says, if, now on the other hand, you do not, here's what's going to happen. You'll have war, enemy occupation. You'll have plagues and famines and droughts, and every evil thing will come upon you. The curses. Then he says, if you persist, Israel, even though I love you, if you persist, I will bring the punishment upon you 7 times over. That's intense. That's a disciplinarian God. As Greg said, to whom much is given, much is required. Did God give a lot to Israel? For what purpose did he give a lot to Israel? I want someone to say it real loud and clear. For what purpose did God give a lot to Israel? So that they can be a witness, a light unto the nations, a servant nation to all the nations. That's why they got a lot. And what did they do with it? They squandered it. God said, no, if you squander what I'm giving you, here's what's going to happen. These things will come upon you. I will multiply your punishment 7 times over. But if you persist, I'm going to drive you out. I'm going to kick you out of the land of Israel, just like I did Yaakov, your father, because God did that to Jacob. I'll kick you out of the land. But in the nations, among the nations, when you are out there, I will give the land its Sabbaths, the Sabbaths that you refuse to give to it, Israel. And the land will have its rest. The land will be restored. And then, at the end of that process, God says in Leviticus chapter 26, I will bring you back. Why? Why did God say that he'll bring them back? Anyone? Because he is faithful to his promise. The prophets all talk about God keeping Israel, preserving them, watching over them as he drives them out. It is a miracle that the people of Israel exist today. It is. Why? Because God has determined that they would be a people before him and that he would restore them. So here we are today. They're restored based on God's promises. God is faithful. So this is what God wanted from Israel at Sinai, faithfulness. And also at Mount Ebal. It didn't quite happen. So now the Samaritans, let's get back to the Samaritans. The Samaritans believed that they replaced Israel. Why? For the same reason that everyone else wants to replace Israel. Israel was unfaithful. Clearly they were. You drove them out. We, the Samaritans, we stayed in the land. We stayed on this mountain, the mountain for your name, Gerizim. Well, they're completely wrong. I'm just going to say that right now with absolute certainty. The Samaritans are wrong. They've been wrong for over 2,000 years. Gerizim is not that mountain. How do we know that? I asked this question earlier. Gerizim is not that mountain. How do we know that? All right. So let's read. Let's get back to Joshua now. Let's go to the book of Joshua. In Joshua chapter 15, 14 and 15, what's happening here? The land has been conquered. No, it hasn't. Israel just got tired of the conflict and they stopped. They ceased to have conflict. There were a few battles, there were a few victories, and they said, okay, we can't possibly conquer this land. Let's stop and divide the land. We'll conquer as we go along. Perhaps is what they said. So Caleb, you know who Caleb was. He was the son of Judah. He was with Joshua as they came into the land. He was with Joshua 40 years earlier with the situation at Kadesh Barnea, right? Caleb. Caleb said, give me the region of what's today Judea. So Joshua said, take Judea, the region of Judea. In the midst of Judea, we have the Jebusites. And Caleb and the sons of Judah were warriors. The people of Judah were warriors. They were the fiercest of all the tribes of Israel, the fiercest. And they were very, very capable. So what did Caleb do to in the region of Judea? He defeated the giants. There were giants in the land. Caleb was a warrior. As old as he was in his 80s or something, and he was a warrior. He was out there killing giants. And his brethren, they were powerful people, the people of Judah. And they took the land that's now today Judea. But when it came to Jerusalem, Jebus, they stopped. For whatever reason, they didn't take what is today Jerusalem. And let's read that here in Joshua chapter 15. So 14 and 15 is about Caleb. 14, chapter 14, verse 15, for instance. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiryat Arba, for Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. Who are the Anakim? They're giants. Then the land rests from war. So Caleb defeated the Anakim. The land rests from war. Chapter 15 now deals with all of the victories of the sons of Judah, all that they conquered. But then it gets down to verse 63. So up to verse 63 of chapter 15 of Joshua is about their victories, their exploits, what they did. Then suddenly in verse 63 we see, now as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out, so the Jebusites lived with the sons of Judah at Jerusalem until this day. Until what day? Whenever the book of Joshua was recorded. We don't know when. So it's a very simple statement. Caleb and the sons of Judah did wonderful, they did exploits, but they couldn't take the Jebusite stronghold. What is the Jebusite stronghold? The Zion. That's the centerpiece of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is effectively nothing without Zion, What is Zion? Zion is that mountain that encompasses Moriah. So if you go down into the Kidron Valley, which I do every time I go, it's my duty to go down into the Kidron Valley and walk up the Zion. June, I remember the year that June insisted that she had to do it. And we had to lift her up the Zion. We carted her up the Zion, took her up. How many of you have walked the Mount Zion? Go up the Zion. All right, it's beautiful. I love it. I cannot go to Jerusalem without doing that at least 3 or 4 times. A few years ago, I was less healthy than I am right now. I'm not healthy right now, but I was less healthy then. And I decided I'm going to run up the mountain. 6 o'clock in the morning, I got to the base of the mountain there by the Mount Zion Hotel, and I started trotting up the mountain. Stones are rolling over, I'm falling, I'm getting up, I'm going. I get to the top, and I say, ha! And I couldn't breathe. I was dying on the top of Mount Zion. So I sat on a rock and I said, you know what, if there's a place to die, this is it. I hate to die right here, but if there's a place to die, I want to die right here on Mount Zion. So I sat there long enough to recover, to catch my breath, and I kept going up to Mount Moriah. Where's Mount Moriah? It's across from Mount Zion. What is Mount Moriah? The Temple Mount. The Temple Mount in Jerusalem today, Mount Moriah. This is what God said concerning Mount Moriah. The place, you know, Adonai Yireh, or Yehovah Yireh. What does Yehovah Yireh mean? Huh? Adonai will see. That's typically what we say. Adonai will see, or Adonai would provide. But it really says in Hebrew, where the Lord will be seen, where Yehovah will be seen. Where he will provide is good too. So this is Mount Moriah. This is what God said about Mount Moriah. What's the significance of Mount Moriah? God made a covenant with Abraham. The covenant was cut in 3 phases: Shechem, Bethel, and Beersheba, which is the region of south, Hebron. Hebron, actually, not Beersheba, Hebron. Isaac had the covenant extended at Beersheba. So you have Shechem, Bethel, and Hebron, which really encompasses the land of Israel. That most important mountain range, Judea, Samaria. So God established that covenant with Abraham in 3 phases. Along the way, he said to Abraham, when Abraham was, I think he was in Beersheba, go to the mountain that I will show you, and there offer your son to me an approach, a sacrifice, a choban, an approach. Abraham said, okay. Took Isaac. Isaac was 34 years old or something at the time, a grown man. Took him, got the mule, and got everything they needed, and headed up to Moriah. Somehow Abraham knew it was Moriah, Zion. You see? God had put it in Abraham's mind, you go to Zion, the place. What does Zion mean? The place. The place what? Where God will provide. Where God will be seen. Moriah. And Abraham went up to Moriah, and there he offered his son. No, he didn't. He offered him, but God didn't receive him. Abraham offered Isaac, folks. He surrendered Isaac. God stopped him. Why did God stop him? Even though Abraham had offered him. Abraham was saying, here he is, God. The offering was made. The approach was made. Abraham proved himself by faith that he was willing to give up his only son, his only begotten son, the son of his love. God stopped him. Why did God stop him? Because he himself was going to carry that out. It had been determined from the world's foundation that he himself will carry out that very act. And he did. In that very same place, Mount Moriah, the Zion, the place where he would be seen. And he was seen. 2,000 years later, his very son appeared, the embodiment of God himself. God in flesh. And he was seen in Zion. He was seen in Zion. He was lifted up in Zion for all the world to see, declaring that this is the place, the Mount Zion. From the very foundation of the world, God had intended this very thing. So, the Samaritans are wrong. The place for God's name is not Gerizim. Gerizim is an important mountain. We love it. We go there, we sing, we dance, we have a beautiful time whenever we go. Don't we? Who was with us the time that we went up there with Shoshana and God just opened up the sky? You remember that? What happened? It was a horrible day. It was wet. It was raining. We were driving through rain clouds going up on this mountain. Literally going through rain clouds. And of course, Shoshana said, well, it's a bad day, but we're going to go anyway. We're not going to be able to see Shechem, but we're going to go. And so we went. And we stood there, and it was cloudy. The cloud was thick, rain all around us. And we stood there looking over the banister at Shechem, but we're not seeing anything. Suddenly, it was as if God said, clouds, be removed. And the whole place became light. And we can see down into the valley. The clouds just parted right there above us. We looked around, those of you that were there, we looked around, and the clouds were all around us. But that space was opened up right before us. So, Gerizim is an important place to God, but it's not the Zion. It is not the place where God will be seen, where he would provide. Did God provide on Zion? What did God provide on Zion? Redemption. His son. He lifted up his son before all the world, provided complete redemption, the blood of the Lamb, the cross, right there on the Zion. The word Moriah also means that God will be seen. God will provide, yes, God will be seen. Ooh. There is a fulfillment of that word, Zion, Moriah, that's yet to come. A complete fulfillment. Jesus will arrive. He will arrive from the right hand of God. He will remove himself, or God will remove him from that place that he's in right now at the right hand of God, and he will come. He will literally come, folks. Not figuratively, not metaphysically. He's going to come. The great King, Jesus himself, Yeshua Jesus our Lord, will come, and he will establish a real kingdom right there on Zion. He will put an end to man's rebellion. He will put an absolute end to it. Man has no chance with him. Their resistance, futile. You've heard that before. Resistance is futile when the righteous king comes to establish the Father's kingdom here on earth. And we're going to be with him. We're going to come with him. Do you believe that? You need to believe it. I'm going to end with this. So, Tisha B'Av. What is Tisha B'Av? Someone tell me, what is Tisha B'Av? Tinnitus. One person, loud and clear. What is Tisha B'Av? Right. How many events? are horrible for the people of Israel historically that points to Tisha B'Av. Kiddush B'Ner, the 10 spies, right? That's what we believe, 10 spies. Destruction of the first temple, second temple, the expulsion edict from Spain, on and on and on and on. Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av. Okay. Now, I don't celebrate Tisha B'Av. I tend to say no. I don't even consider Tisha B'Av. You know, it's a big time for them. That's them. That's not us. Now, what happened last Tisha B'Av, just a couple of weeks ago? Anyone knows? Something really significant happened that relates to the Temple Mount. What happened? Something big happened. 1,500 Jews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, went up on the Temple Mount and prayed. And they weren't supposed to. They all decided, that's it, we're going up to the Temple Mount, the Zion, Mount Moriah, and they prayed. Well, lo and behold, within 2 days, videos are being made and put onto the internet. Bunches of them. Prophetic teachers, Christian prophetic teachers. And what were they saying about the event on Mount Moriah? You take a guess. What were these teachers of Bible prophecy saying about what happened last Tisha B'Av? You guess. I give you 2 guesses. First person, what happened? What were the prophecy teachers saying following Tisha B'Av? One person. First person. You gotta guess. You gotta guess this. What were they saying as a result? The pre-tribulation people. What were they saying about Jews going up on the Temple Mount? This is an easy question. One person. Steve? Steve said it. And I mean, they were excited. They were printing, they were doing things, videos, making videos, podcasting. This means that the Antichrist is here. That's what they were saying. Antichrist temple is about to be built. And you know what that means? What does that mean? The next question, someone answered. What does it mean? God. Tribulation, well, that's the Antichrist period, right? But what happens? What does it mean? We're being raptured out of here, folks. So, just 3 weeks ago, 1,500 Jews get up on the Temple Mount, and they prayed to God on the Zion, on Mount Moriah, the place where God will establish his name, according to what he said. Did God mean it? Did God mean it when he said that he will establish his name there? 12 times in four chapters? What do you think? What we just read tonight at the beginning of tonight's Torah portion, the place where God will establish his name. Did he mean it? Well, these Bible prophecy teachers has revelation that's beyond the Bible. That the devil will establish his name on that spot. Isn't that what they're saying? If the Antichrist is going to build a temple and sit and reign in it while we are raptured out of here and God will destroy Israel, destroy the world, that spot is not the Zion. It's not the place. And this brings me to the core of tonight's message. It points to the fallacy of Christian doctrine that says the Zion is actually heaven. Not here, not Jerusalem. And that's the essence of the pre-tribulation rapture. God's taken us out of here, folks. We're being swooped away from here while he dishes out all of the heartache, all of the troubles, all of the pain that he possibly can. The Jews whooped upon completely. Beaten into submission. It's heresy. It's heresy because it's contrary to the Word of God. It blasphemes the Word of God. So all of these wonderful prophetic teachers who knows more than the actual Word of God, they are heretics, folks. And they are blaspheming the Word of God with their horrible statements about that's where the Antichrist is going to reign. Folks, the Antichrist is already in the temple, in the Nahos. He is. The Antichrist have been here for 1,500 years, folks. The Nahos is what, Amado? The Nahos is what? I put Amado on the spot. The church. Yes. The church. Constantine, the most clear and consistent archetype of Antichrist, took his place in the church. And the church today still defends him. Even your evangelical church. Your wonderful evangelical postmodern church. You go there. You love it. It's beautiful. It's wonderful. I have all these goosebumps experiences. God must be here because I have these goosebumps. You go speak to the pastor. Set an appointment. Sit with him. Bring up Constantine, the lawless one, and see what he does. He will invariably defend him. He is the Antichrist. Antichrist is alive in the church today. He's already in the temple. Don't look for him in Jerusalem, because the word that Paul used for temple is neos, the spiritual temple, not Heron, a physical temple. The Zion is where God is going to establish his name. A literal place, a literal kingdom, a literal temple, a literal high priest, a literal king in Zion. Now, I'll tell you right now, if you have a real problem with what I just said, and you want to walk with us, deal with that problem. Because it's going to keep hitting you in the face. It's going to keep smacking you. There he goes again. He's making that statement that I don't like. I can't be here. You go, you come back 2 weeks later. No. Deal with it. Hash it out. How do you hash it out? You go into the Word. Take everything I said and put it to the test. And if it's true, what I say, you got a dilemma. What's your dilemma? To choose the Word of God or to choose the prophets that are prophesying heresy? Supporting the Antichrist. Don't even know it. Should know it. But don't even know it. Supporting the Antichrist. Why should all of Christianity know that the Antichrist is walking among them? Why should they know this? Someone. Yes? Yes. Yes. Because of what Paul said in 2 Thessalonians, yes. Why else should all of Christianity be pretty assured that the Antichrist is walking in their midst? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. There's something else. God, I'm being rhetorical. Okay. History. History. The historiography. The story of the history is there. What the church did following Nicaea. Every council that undermined the Word of God is evidence that the Antichrist is walking with them. Now, why is this so hard for them to figure out? Why do they struggle so much with this? They can't see it. Why is it that blinders have been cast over their faces? Anyone? I'm just asking all these questions. Anyone? Why is the church blinded from the reality that Antichrist is in their midst? Try and answer that question, Haven. She's working on it. I give you a few seconds. All right, okay.
Because there's a great deal of power, authority, and money.
Okay, that's part of it. There's something much more spiritual.
Selfishness is original sin.
Okay, but there's something much more deep and much more spiritual that's preventing the church from seeing it. Huh? I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. There's. I'm hoping you have it.
In order for you to receive and see the truth, you have to humble yourself before the Lord your God in order for you to receive it.
Okay.
So if you don't open yourself, you can't receive it because you can't see it. So God gives you up to a reprobate mind, to your lies and to your deceit, because that's what you are comfortable with.
And I knew that that Mildred would touch on it. The church is demonized, given over to deception, unable to see the condition that they are in. A person who is unwilling to see the truth of God will never see it until God intervenes. And in many cases, God will come knocking on their door. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And Jesus is knocking on the door of the church. He did that in 1517 with Martin Luther. He knocked on that door. And they just opened it a little bit like this. They let a little bit of Jesus come in, the Word of God. That door needs to be kicked wide open, folks, so that the Word of God will consume the church completely, and the church would be reformed. It always comes down to this, doesn't it? The church is unreformed, need to be reformed, need to be delivered from what happened at Nicaea. The only way the church can be delivered of Nicaea is to denounce it, folks. Someone who is possessed by the devil, demonized. They will remain demonized until they decide, I'm going to fight, I'm going to stand, I'm going to denounce, I'm going to believe. The church hasn't been in that place. Now, many people, many factors of the church has broken off. We are. We have been delivered from Nicaea. As a result, you, Fellowship Church, and many more like you, you are the tip of the spear of Reformation. You and others. You're at the tip of the spear, and God's throwing, he's moving forward with that spear. The church ultimately will reform. All of the church? No. A necessary factor of the church will fully reform and stand in Zion with the great king who will rule the world. The prophecy people will lose their minds, because on the day of his arrival, they will point him out as the Antichrist. That's what's coming, folks. The church is so blinded in their prophetic understanding that when Jesus actually shows up, brings the living temple to Jerusalem, they will be completely confuffled. What's that word mean? Who knows? They would be completely confused, and they will declare that the Antichrist is upon the scene. Get ready, we're being raptured. That's right. So let me say that I had no idea that I was going to go this far tonight. I can go further. It'll take all night. But folks, that's where we are. It's about Zion. It's not about some metaphysical, some spiritual place. It's about Zion, right here on this planet, in Jerusalem. God will lift up his standard for all the nations to see. And that standard would be Jesus himself, and we alongside him. That's the end of the story. That's when God will be seen in Zion, Moriah. God will provide, and then he will be seen. Shabbat Shalom.